India, 6th century BCE. Princess Yasodhara stirs in her sleep, her newborn son in her arms, warm and safe, not even a day old. But suddenly she feels like someone's watching her. She sits up to look at an empty doorway. No one. To reassure herself, she turns and reaches across the bed toward her husband, Prince Siddhartha, but he's not there. Yasodhara runs through the palace, alerting guards, and her in-laws, the king and queen. The prince is gone! Is he taken? Riders go out into the night, soldiers comb the countryside. And at last, a servant returns with news. He had located Prince Siddhartha on the road, and the prince had given him a message. Siddhartha had given up worldly things and become a wandering ascetic. As proof, he holds out the royal vestments and symbols of rank that the prince handed him. Yasodhara falls to her knees wailing, glancing over at the child that her husband had never held. Would you like to see the first episode of our brand new Henry Ford series immediately after watching this episode 2 full weeks early? Well, with Nebula you totally can. Learn how after the episode. In our recent History of Buddhism series, we told one of the more common versions of the life of Siddhartha Gautama, better known as the Buddha, including the story of his renunciation, where he left his palace to seek spiritual truths. But no one's life exists in a vacuum, so when Siddhartha renounced his power, position, and wealth, he also renounced his life as a husband and a father. He didn't just leave treasure behind, but people. Chief among them being his wife, Princess Yasodhara. And her story, or rather the stories told about her, gives us a fascinating insight into how Buddhists formed their image of Buddha, the tensions between monks and society, and the role women play in the religion. According to tradition, Princess Yasodhara was born on the same day and month as her future husband Siddhartha. She was from a neighboring republic, and their families generally married each other, making them distant cousins. And while married at the age of 16, in some stories, they were actually karmically betrothed before they were born. A famous tale tells that in a previous rebirth, the pair were an ascetic and an aristocratic lady that paired up to clean an overgrown roadway for a holy man to pass through, with the future Siddhartha even using his body as a bridge across a muddy spot that had not yet been cleared. Then when the holy man granted each a request, the future Siddhartha asked to be reborn as a holy man himself who would relieve the world's suffering. The future Yasodhara, on the other hand, asked to help on this holy mission and be the wife of the young ascetic in all future rebirths. A request this previous incarnation of Siddhartha was not happy about, by the way. He had already given up worldly things like wives, and he didn't want to go backwards in the next life. But the holy man calmed him, saying that renouncing a future family would be one of the most important steps in his path of enlightenment. Speaking of which, fast forward one lifetime and a rebirth, and a 29-year-old Yasodhara wakes up to find her husband has bailed. The two would not meet again for years. At least, that's how tradition records it, because the earliest documents actually contain nothing about Yasodhara, failing to mention the Buddha married and fathered a son. In those records, Buddha tells his father and stepmother he's leaving, rather than sneaking out on a wife and son. In fact, as a result, there are actually some historians who argue that Yasodhara never even existed, and was an invention of later Buddhist authors who wanted to portray Buddha taking part in normative family life. However, others point out that his leaving on the eve of a son's birth would make a certain sense. See, at the time, aristocrats were only allowed to become religious ascetics after producing a son to secure the family line. Stories also differ on how Buddha's son Rahula got his name, which means fetter. In all of them, though, Siddhartha considers his new son a hindrance on his new spiritual quest, and basically calls him a ball and chain or an obstacle to be overcome. Many traditions even state that Siddhartha refused to hold Rahula before he left, worrying it would tempt him to stay. But that is not the last we see of the Buddha's abandoned wife and son. Oh no. In fact, Yasodhara went on a spiritual quest of her own. After Siddhartha had attained enlightenment and began to teach, Yasodhara followed news of his spiritual progress from afar. And after learning about the codes of behavior Buddha had laid out for his monks, she adopted them, eating 1 meal a day, sleeping on a hard floor rather than a bed, and meditating. Often described as an act of loyalty, it might also be seen as an act of faith or a search for meaning. And that was her life. Simple meditation and raising her son, until the day her husband returned to the city. Rahula watched from the walls, entranced by the Enlightened One, surrounded by 2,000 followers. Yasodhara then joined him. "That's your father," she said. "You must ask him for your inheritance." Now, this request has been suggested that it might have been a legal formality, that Siddhartha had never formally designated Rahula as his heir. But in other stories, she was actually hoping that Rahula's visit would tempt Siddhartha back to the palace. But regardless, when Rahula came to his father and asked for said inheritance, a strange thing happened. He left again, and Rahula followed him. And when Rahula caught up with the Buddha at his next destination, Buddha gave him his answer. Should he give Rahula a kingdom, that throne would crumble and pass away. I will give him the wealth I obtained under the tree of enlightenment, he said, making him the heir of inheritance that does not perish. He had Rahula ordained as the first Buddhist novice monk, and his son would go on to be one of Buddha's inner circle of disciples. Meanwhile, at the palace, Yasodhara had now lost her husband and her young son to the path of enlightenment, but they would all be reunited. When Siddhartha's stepmother, Maje Prajapati, led a group of 500 women to Buddha's forest sanctuary and petitioned to be ordained as nuns, Yasodhara was among them. When the Buddha turned them down, they asked his attendant Ananda to press their case. And when confronted with the question of whether women could attain enlightenment and nirvana, the Buddha said they could. It was a position he'd stated before, but now had to put into practice. But there are also stories about the Buddha denigrating women, saying they would destroy the movement in 500 years, but some of those appear to have been inserted into later translations. In fact, Buddha at one point supposedly mentioned that gender made no difference to enlightenment. For Yasodhara, this acceptance as a nun was only a formalization of how she'd lived for years, but it also reunited her blood family in a spiritual community. There, she flourished, attaining a state of enlightenment within her lifetime, but not full nirvana. However, a story in the later Lotus Sutra claims that the Buddha himself declared that his former wife and stepmother would both attain Buddhahood. She died at the age of 78, surviving her son but not her former husband, who would live another 2 years. Now, the story of Yasodhara, with its many faces and variations, reveals interesting things about Buddhism's early and evolving relationship with women and family. It's clear from the records that early Buddhists considered a family to be stumbling blocks on the way to spiritual attainment, and that removal from even the most personal connections was necessary to walk the path. But other traditions may be defensive, meant to show that Buddha could marry and reproduce, both things considered necessary at the time for great men to do. As for Yasodhara, her faithfulness would serve as an example for future women in Buddhism, whether that be the esoteric traditions of the Himalayas where women take major roles in ritual, Empress Wu Zetian, who helped spread the religion in China, or nuns today who are pushing to recreate their orders in Theravada Buddhism. But also, the story of Yasodhara expresses the emotional tension between family and enlightenment. These stories don't shy away from the emotional anguish Siddhartha's quest caused his family, and that's still an issue in Buddhism today. After all, not every parent or spouse is happy when a loved one becomes a monk. Even in the days of instant communication, it can still be hard for families to see members enter a monastery. And some modern readers have recast Siddhartha's renunciation as a story of divorce. Because like many religious tales, the enduring power of Yasodhara's story is how it can be reinterpreted to serve different cultures and uses. Depending on how it's told, she can be an obstacle to the Buddha, a devout supporter, or a tragic martyr figure. But however the story is told, this image of Siddhartha looking on at his sleeping wife and child, knowing he's going to leave them, remains potently heart-wrenching over 2 millennia after it was recorded. And as we close out this series, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming along with us on this 6-week exploration into Buddhism's expansion and its major historical players. I love this series deeply, and I was so excited when our patrons voted on it. But you know, one of the reasons that we as a studio can take the time to explore topics like this that might not be as flashy as, say, well-known wars or ubiquitous famous figures is due to the support that we get from Nebula, our favorite creator-owned and operated streaming service. And actually, with the help of a bunch of our creator friends over on Nebula, we've ramped up an awesome feature called Nebula First. Basically, it works like this. Thanks to their support, we can produce and release our extra history series episodes on Nebula at least a full week before they're posted to YouTube. However, this time around, I am very excited to announce that you can actually go watch the first episode of our brand new series on Henry Ford 2 whole weeks early right now over on Nebula. Unable to wait for the seat carriage he ordered to come, Ford decides to take his first drive on the quadricycle at 3 in the morning when these streets will be empty. He begins to push it out of the shed, but then suddenly stops. Oh no, there's a variable he never accounted for, despite 2 years of testing. It's too big to fit through the door. Not to worry. Ford hacks through the doorframe with an axe, then once freed from the prison shed, Henry Ford is driving his first vehicle. And that is just the beginning, because you also get access to a ton of other great Nebula First content from creators like Tierzoo, Chubby Emu, Tail Foundry, and way more, all posting their videos earlier than you'd get to see them on YouTube. Not to mention the ever-growing library of Nebula originals that you can't see anywhere else. Case in point, I just can't get enough of Real Life Lore's Modern Conflict series, and I just finished the episode on the fall of ISIS, which is a topic I actually thought I knew a bunch about, but I learned that I had barely scratched the surface thanks to Joseph and his team. Man, what a wonderful series that is. Plus, that's on top of the exclusive shows we've done and the Nebula classes that both Jeff and I have made and are super proud of. I really do hope you check those out. Now, Nebula is normally priced at a pretty dang reasonable $50 a year, but if you sign up using our link below, we're gonna knock $20 right off that price because you are my favorite. Meaning you'll get Nebula for only $2.50 a month when you sign up for an annual plan. Hey, look at you doing math. Actually, hold the phone for a moment. Hi, IRL Matt here, breaking into animated ad space to let you know I just heard that Nebula is opening up the lifetime subscription option as well for just $300 for a limited time in September. Meaning basically, if you are enjoying what we and all of the other creators are doing over on Nebula and you're planning on sticking around for a while, this is a really awesome way to support creators just taking big swings right away, which I thought was so important that I had to interrupt animated Matt's ad read for. Hey, you're not a cartoon. He found me. I gotta go. And actually, one more really cool part we've never talked about when discussing Nebula before is all the different platforms you can now watch your shiny new Nebula subscription on, thanks to the dedicated apps for Apple TV, Android TV, Fire TV, Samsung, LG, Roku, or using Chromecast. Plus, you can take Nebula on the go via iOS or Android, complete with the ability to download videos for offline play, which honestly has been an absolute game changer for me with all of the travel I've been doing this summer. I mean, how else am I supposed to keep up with jet lag unless I am literally jet lagged? Of course, I would be happy to keep singing Nebula's praises all day, but I think it is really something you should experience for yourself. Not to mention using our link below to sign up really does help support myself and the rest of the EC crew make the content you love while also helping us not be entirely dependent on YouTube for our livelihoods, which is, I have to say, just a wonderful feeling to get to have. Thank you so much for that. And yeah, I really hope you check out Nebula because I really think you're gonna dig it. What if I told you that Ahmed Ziad Turk, Angela Valenciana, Arclight Games, Casey Mustra, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Blame, Kuya Koi, and Skylar Holmes were all legendary patrons? I'm not kidding.